Imagine marching for weeks through cold mud, your armor rubbing raw against your shoulders, your stomach tightening with hunger. Now imagine the only thing waiting for dinner is a chunk of bread so hard it could crack a tooth. When people picture medieval warfare, they imagine clashing swords, shining armor, heroic knights charging across battlefields. But the truth? Most soldiers spent far more time thinking about food than fighting, because on campaign, survival depended not on glory, but on whatever you could swallow. And what medieval soldiers really ate was often far stranger, rougher, and sometimes far more desperate than anything shown in movies. To understand it, we have to step into the boots of a soldier marching somewhere in Europe around the 13th century. The army moves slowly. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of men travel together across dirt roads and frozen fields. Knights ride horses at the front, banners snapping in the wind. But behind them comes the real body of the army. Foot soldiers, archers, laborers, cooks, blacksmiths, and boys leading pack animals. All of them need food, every single day. And feeding an army in the medieval world was a logistical nightmare. There were no refrigerated wagons, no canned goods, no modern supply chains. Instead, most soldiers carried their food with them. If you looked inside a typical soldier's pack, the first thing you'd find would be bread, but not the soft bread you buy today. Medieval campaign bread was usually hardtack or coarse loaves made from barley, rye, or oats. These breads were dense, dry, and baked so hard they could survive weeks of travel without rotting. Sometimes soldiers had to soak the bread in water, beer, or broth just to make it chewable. But bread alone couldn't sustain a marching army. So the next staple was meat. Not fresh meat, that would spoil quickly. Instead, soldiers carried preserved meat, salted pork, smoked beef, dried fish, or strips of tough, jerky-like flesh. Salt was the key to survival. Barrels filled with salted pork traveled with many armies, especially wealthier ones. The meat inside was packed so heavily with salt that soldiers often had to soak it in water before cooking it. Even then, the flavor could be brutal, salty, rubbery, sometimes nearly inedible. But hunger makes almost anything taste acceptable. Still, there was one thing medieval soldiers drank far more often than water: beer. Yes, beer. And not just for pleasure. Water sources on campaign were often contaminated. Rivers carried mud, animal waste, and disease. Drinking straight from them could make soldiers violently ill. But weak beer, sometimes called small ale, was safer because the brewing process killed many harmful organisms. It was low in alcohol, but it provided calories, hydration, and a small boost of morale. A marching soldier might drink several pints a day. By modern standards, the medieval battlefield ran partly on beer. Yet even this basic diet, bread, salted meat, and ale, was a luxury compared to what many soldiers actually experienced. Because once an army moved deep into enemy territory, something else became the primary source of food. Not supply wagons, not rations, but the land itself. And what soldiers found, or took, from that land would shape some of the darkest and most desperate meals of medieval warfare. Because sometimes Dinner depended on what you could steal before the enemy arrived. Once an army marched far enough from its home territory, the carefully packed barrels of salted pork and sacks of bread began to disappear. Food ran out quickly. Thousands of hungry men could empty supply wagons in a matter of days, and medieval commanders knew something modern armies would later turn into a formal strategy. Armies often lived off the land, which sounds simple until you understand what it actually meant. Picture a column of soldiers approaching a small farming village somewhere in France or England. The villagers might see them hours before they arrive. Dust rising on the horizon, banners fluttering, the dull metallic glint of helmets in the sun. For the villagers, it was a terrifying sight, because an army didn't just pass through, it consumed everything. Chickens vanished first. They were easy to grab, easy to cook, and incredibly valuable sources of protein. Soldiers might snap their necks, pluck them quickly, and roast them over open fires that night. Pigs were even better. A single pig could feed dozens of men. Soldiers would slaughter them on the spot, carving the meat into rough chunks and boiling it in large iron pots if the army had cooks traveling with them. Cows were rarer targets, not because soldiers didn't want them, but because cattle were harder to transport and required time to butcher properly. But when an army captured one, it became a feast. Stews simmered over campfires. Meat cooked slowly with onions, herbs, or whatever vegetables could be gathered from nearby fields. Those were the good nights, the kind soldiers remembered. But most days, the food was far less impressive. Grain stores inside barns were often the true prize. Barley, wheat, oats, anything that could be ground into flour or boiled into porridge. Soldiers might carry small hand mills to grind grain themselves. Otherwise, they simply boiled it whole into a thick, bland gruel. Imagine a pot filled with cracked barley, water, and maybe a few scraps of meat. That was dinner. Sometimes soldiers added wild plants gathered along the road, onions, leeks, garlic, cabbage leaves, even herbs pulled from gardens. These small additions could transform a pot of dull grain into something almost comforting. But this system, living off the land, had a dark side. Because when armies stripped villages bare, the next army found nothing. Fields trampled, livestock gone, barns empty. And when food truly ran out, soldiers became desperate. Chroniclers from the medieval period describe armies eating things most modern people would never consider. Horses that collapsed from exhaustion were quickly butchered. Mules and pack animals, once essential for carrying supplies, became emergency meals. Dogs sometimes disappeared from villages after soldiers passed through. Even leather could become food. Belts, saddle straps, and pieces of boiled leather armor might be cut into strips and softened in water for hours until they could be chewed. It tasted terrible. But starvation changes the rules of what counts as food. And there was another brutal reality about medieval armies. Not everyone ate equally. Knights and commanders had first claim on the best food. Fresh meat, bread from proper ovens, sometimes even wine. But the ordinary foot soldier, he survived on whatever remained. Sometimes that meant a bowl of thin grain porridge after a 12-hour march. Sometimes it meant nothing at all. Yet, despite all these hardships, there was one moment every soldier secretly hoped for during a campaign, a moment when the hardships of marching, hunger, and cold suddenly disappeared. Because after certain victories, an army didn't just eat, it feasted. And those feasts could transform a starving camp into something that looked almost like a medieval festival. But the food on those nights could be both spectacular and deeply unsettling. Because victory meals on the medieval battlefield often came with a darker story behind them. For days, sometimes weeks, a medieval army might march on little more than hard bread, salted meat, and thin porridge. Men grew gaunt, tempers grew short, campfires burned low because there was little worth cooking. Then suddenly, everything could change in a single day. Victory. When a city fell, when an enemy camp was captured, or when a battlefield was won, food appeared in overwhelming abundance. Because medieval armies didn't just defeat enemies, they captured their supplies. And enemy supply trains were treasure troves, barrels of grain, wheels of cheese, whole sides of beef hanging from wagons, wine casks sloshing with deep red liquid. For soldiers who had been chewing dry bread for weeks, it felt like stumbling into paradise. Campfires multiplied across the dark fields. Huge iron cauldrons were dragged out. Meat was hacked into rough chunks and tossed into boiling water. Fat crackled over open flames as strips of pork roasted on improvised spits made from spears or broken wagon parts. The smell alone could drive men half mad with hunger. Imagine the scene. Thousands of soldiers sitting on the ground under a dark sky, armor loosened, helmets tossed aside, hands greasy with meat, steam rising from stew pots, ale splashing into wooden cups. For a few hours, the exhaustion of marching vanished. Someone might start singing. Another man laughs too loudly. A knight's squire sneaks an extra loaf of bread and passes it around his friends. After weeks of hunger, a victory feast could feel almost unreal. But even these celebrations carried reminders of the brutal world these soldiers lived in. Because much of the food they enjoyed came from plunder. Captured villages, raided farms, enemy supply wagons seized after battle. For the soldiers, this was simply how war worked. Food was victory, and victory meant eating well, at least for a night. Yet these moments of abundance were usually short-lived. The next morning, the army packed up again. The fires burned down to ash, barrels emptied, bones scattered across the ground, and the march resumed. Soon enough, the familiar routine returned. Hard bread, salted meat, thin beer, perhaps a pot of barley porridge if someone managed to find grain along the road. For the vast majority of soldiers, medieval warfare was not a story of heroic charges or shining armor. It was a story of hunger, of constant searching for the next meal, of chewing through dry bread while marching across freezing fields, of boiling whatever scraps could be found in a dented iron pot over a smoky fire. And that reality shaped armies just as much as swords and shields did. Because a hungry soldier could not march, a starving army could not fight. In the end, the true fuel of medieval warfare wasn't glory. It was bread, salt, and whatever the land, or fate, was willing to provide.